Yo, what's going on, guys? Hope everybody's having a great day today. So, today's video, we're going to be talking about APIs and what is CRUD. What are CRUD operations? Why should you use an API? Why is it important to have that for your web application or website? Why is that so important? So, first things first, an API is just a set of rules and protocols that allows different software applications to communicate. That's all it is. So, it just allows you to get data from the back end, whether it's from your database or somewhere else, allows it to set that information or create that information within a JSON object that can be easily transferable to your application. And you could use that data to map out whatever UI that you're building in real time. And then also, it just an endpoint, it's just a URL, a basic URL that you could call to get data, create data, delete it. Doesn't matter what you want to do. It's just an easy way that web applications communicate. All right. So CRUD operations already talked about that a little bit, but it just stands for create, read, update, and delete. Okay. So some of the ways you would do all these things, at least from an API, is post, get, put, patch, and delete. And I'll talk about the differences between put and patch just so that you're not confused on that. But you could see here what the purpose is for each of these, right? And they're outlined pretty. It's a pretty simple setup. So when you're posting data, you're creating it. When you're getting data, you're just reading whatever that API is allowed to give you, whatever data that that API is allowed to give you, and bring that back to your front end. When you're updating things, you would either use a put method or a patch method to modify that data. And then delete, I wouldn't use delete for anything unless you give consent to do it, because you could obviously delete something that you didn't mean to and then it's lost forever and you can't restore that. That's where, if it's something that you can delete, you have to have safeguards in place, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But these are the ways that you could do it. Okay. Now, put versus patch, what's the difference? So a put method is, think about the entire object. So whatever object that you want to update in your database, if it's an entire row itself in the database, you will use a put method, right? You will call your API to update this object based on the ID, and whatever the object is, you make changes to that within that object, and then you're pushing it to a backend function that will process that data and update the database accordingly. All right. Now, when you're thinking about just updating some information, so say for example, you have a user profile, right? And you want to update your address. That will be a patch situation. That's all you're updating. So any fields that have been updated, you will keep track of that. And then you will call the patch method within your API to just update that information for that database row. When you're dealing with APIs, it gets kind of confusing in terms of, debugging, right? So some of the things that you can do is look at the status code that is sent from that API from your backend. So first things first, when everything is successful, 200 success code means that everything was processed correctly and there's no issues. A 201 means that you created something on the back end and everything's all good. And then a 204 means that you didn't send down a JSON payload for processing. All right. Now, with any errors that come up on the client side, it could be that the API is malformed. When you're looking at a 400 error, or a 404 means that the data is not there or the API doesn't exist. And also, like, any validation errors and all that stuff, you can handle that on your back end and send that to your front end so that people understand exactly what's going on. And then as a developer, you can understand exactly what's going on too, so you can quickly debug and fix those issues. And then 500 errors are bad. They're really bad. So if you get an internal server error for your API, that means that something's going on with the server, that you can't contact the server. It maybe it doesn't exist. You have to look into that. Maybe there's like an error within the code itself on the back end that's causing that. You have to look into all that stuff. And then a 503 means that the service is not available, meaning that something's going on with your server. All right. And with that, there are some best practices with dealing with APIs. I think some of the fundamentals that you need to learn is error handling. If you're not dealing with error handling in any shape or form, is going to cause a lot of issues and headaches when trying to debug things. And then also, the users that are using your app is going to be confused. So if a user's trying to save their information for a profile and they're not getting a confirmation that something was successful, you're going to run into a lot of people just clicking save the entire time, thinking that their information is not saved. When in fact it did work correctly, it's just that you didn't have any indication that something was successful. So error handling will save you a lot of time and headache for that, and your users will love that, so that you have clear indication of what's going on and what's happening. Loading states, so like when you're getting data, you just don't want the page to be blank. You kind of want to show at least like some type of animation, a loading animation or something that you're trying to get data. And the best way to go about this, especially if you're using React, is using tan query, because it has everything baked in there to where you could check for if something was fetched, if something is loading properly. Did you get the data? Did you not get the data? There's so many different ways you could do this and actually have that baked into your code to where you could show users the correct UI response. All right. Also, front end validation. So you could use, depending on if you're using forms, you could use Zod. You could use the backend to validate some of the information that you have before you send it to the backend for processing. Making sure that you're securing the data that is being sent to your backend. That's very important. You don't want to do everything over HTTP because that is vulnerable to attacks. You could run into a man in the middle attack to where a bad actor could just be in the middle of those API requests and actually pull sensitive information out of it and do whatever they want to it. Okay. So you have to have that security layer around your API request. And the easiest path would just be using HTTPS. All right. Rate limiting your APIs is very important too. Think about if you had a button action that calls an API to refresh data every single time, you would have some type of rate limiting on that. So if I was to click the button every single time, right? In the span of like 10 seconds, I made about 5 or more API requests. That's a huge red flag. And having a rate limiting system would allow you to figure out who's a bad actor on your site, who's just clicking buttons for whatever reason, and catching some of the malicious activity that some people would do when they're calling an API. So having rate limiting, you could block people when it comes to making those requests and actually have a log of it of who did what. You could cache those responses too. So if the data hasn't changed in any way, you don't have to necessarily make that API call anymore, but you could cache that on your front end if you want to, and then also documentation. So you could use Swagger to do all this Swagger API, and then it types everything out for you. So if there's any objects that you are sending to the front end, or if you're going to be sending to your back end, you would have types for every single object that you will be accounting for. And if there's any new data objects that you're adding to that, you could just update the documentation so that people could know, okay, with this endpoint, we're updating data, we're deleting data, we're creating it, we're getting the data that we need, and you don't have to necessarily guess what API route does what. In this demo, the way I'm going to be showing you guys how APIs work is I found this JSON placeholder website, and I'll just go to it real quick so I can give you guys an idea of what it is. But basically, it's just a fake API. It just has fake API data. There's like, if you're using JavaScript, obviously you could use the fetch to do this, or use Axios to set that up. But when I click on, we're going to be using the users endpoint. And when I click on the users endpoint, you can see this is the type of data that we're getting. So this is a JSON object with a bunch of information in it. And this application is pretty much using that route to show you how APIs work in real time. All right. Axios is really good if you want to set up your API library or making requests and all that stuff. Use Axios for React. React hooks like use state, use effect to do everything. I mean, pretty straightforward. And then using modern JavaScript to handle promises and all that stuff. We're waiting to make sure that we're getting data first before we show it on the front end. If we are, doing anything server side, we want to make sure that we wait for the response first before we make the request. And then some of the API request structure looks like this. So if you look at a response to get data, this is the type of endpoint that we would use. But anything that you would typically want to get from an endpoint, you would have your URL and then the route that you want to call to do that. And then you're awaiting the response from that API. Once you get the 200 response, then you could set that up as JSON to do whatever you want in your front end. For post request, you would just pass in the name, the email. I honestly would just use the ID of that object so you don't have to go by names, because there could be someone in your system with the same name or the same email address. You don't want to deal with that conflict. And then put, so as you can see with this example, we're using the ID to update the data and sending that as a complete user object. And when we're deleting stuff, this is how we're doing it. So that's in a nutshell what an API is. It's very straightforward. Once you get rolling with this, is going to be night and day difference of just setting up your routes and making sure that you're making the right request. Okay. Now to talk about the CRUD operations, this is what it is. So first we're going to talk about reading, right? So how do you get data from an API? So the first thing that you would need to do is you get a request, and we're using the user's route, right? So all this data that we see here, we're just getting that data via the API. You could see that everything is pretty much laid out here in a nice UI format, right? All the users, and if you look back at the data here, you can see that this is the same data. Leanne, Graham, Irvin Howell, Clementine Bouch, right? Like all this stuff. Now, these are the IDs for each thing. And, say for example, if I'm an admin user and I want to delete a user profile, right? Because the user didn't subscribe to like a product or something like that, you could pretty much delete that user or maybe just hide them or disable them. You have to make sure that you can delete the information, number one. But then also, is that data still going to be in the database, right? If that's not going to be the case, then you could just purge it from your database. That's cool. That's fine, but you could have a lot of issues when you do this. So when you delete something, you see how we get this user deleted successfully. This is bad because when you're deleting information here, you need to have some type of like confirmation that you actually want to delete this information, because you could make an error, right? You can make a mistake just by me clicking this. I just deleted that user. Now information is gone, right? Luckily, we could just refresh this and we're back to normal, but you need to make sure that you have a confirmation window of some sort to show the user, like, hey, are you sure you want to delete this user? Like, actually have pre-checked before doing that, because it could save you a lot of time trying to restore that data back. So that's something that you should look into. Now, creating data, we're going to just create a user. So I'm just going to do like John Doe, actually, then JD Gmail, and we're just going to create that. And it left out the phone number and website. So as you can see, this is what this would look like. This is the object that we're sending down to our backend, our API, to then create that user. So depending on if you needed phone and website to be required in this case, the backend will look at that and it will provide a front end error and all that stuff, right? But because we're only looking at name and email as like important, all this other information could get left out. All right. So that's how you would create data. We could do another one, right? We could do test 123, test at Gmail, and this will be 555. All right. Create that, and you can see what that data looks like. All right. So this is ways that you could test if your API is working or not. You could test whether it's malformed and all that stuff. If there's any other requirements and all that, you could deal with that. Okay. So that's how you would essentially create data using the post method. And then when you're updating data now, there's going to be a difference between put and patch, right? So like I said in the beginning, when you're using a put, you're updating the entire object. You need the complete object in order for this to work. If you're just updating, say for example, like the name or the username, then a patch will get called in this case. So we're going to fetch a user, and in this case, we have Leanne here, right? And we're going to do a put. And what I'm going to do is just change her email to .edu and then also remove the extension. Now, when I do this, everything, so like all of the information that we care about that you can actively update would just be the name, email, phone number, but we need the entire object to do this. Now, if we were to do a patch, and do the same thing, is only going to be a little bit of of that data, right? So depending on what you want to do and how you're doing it, and actually let me see it in the network tab. Yeah, in the network tab here, just to show you guys like how it looks. So this is our payload, right? We're only sending down this in our patch. Now, if you were to do a put, it's the entire object here. We're just sending down all the information that we care about, the email, phone number, right? Whatever was updated. So in this case, depending on your use case, you can use a patch just for partial updates or a put for full updates, right? Now delete. This is, I mean, if you expose deletion for your APIs, I think it should be at an admin level. You know what I'm saying? So you have to have, you have to take care of that. Whatever data that you're trying to delete in your database, you need to be very careful. Okay, so that's very important. So here we have a user. I'm just going to do user three, and we have a user that we're going to be deleting from our API. And then I'm going to open developer tools just to show you exactly what that looks like in a network tab. I love something like this. So if I'm trying to delete a user from my application, I need to make sure that I can confirm this deletion. It's not just, okay, I'm gonna fetch the user, then when I click on the delete key, then it's gonna delete all that data. So once I confirm that I want to delete this is our pre-check, right? Are you sure you want to delete this user? I'm gonna click OK. We're gonna look at the response, and you can see it's empty, right? But we got a 200 okay for that deletion. If I was to fetch that user again, obviously this is a simulation, so it won't be, we're not actually deleting any users from this API per se, but you could use something like this to confirm whether you want to delete a user or not. Click continue. It'll tell you whether that user was deleted successfully and all that stuff. Have these confirmation statuses to tell you if this is working or not. And then if you look at the code itself, and I'm going to show you exactly what the services is. The way we're getting all users, like we're using this backslash users endpoint, right? And then depending on what we're doing, we could get the user by ID, we could create the user based on the user endpoint, all that. When we're doing a post, same thing. Depending on what you want to do and depending on what those endpoints are, or those routes, you could successfully configure that within your application. Now, if I was to go to my API setup, you can see that the base URL is the JSON placeholder link. And then we are using Axios to kind of set up our API so that we can use it within our application on the back end at least. And deal with like any errors, any configuration issues, all that. So it's very simple, cut and dry to how you could set up your APIs. I mean, this is pretty straightforward on how you would return data response, return just based on the put, the post, the patch, all that info. And you could tailor your application to work in that way. But in this case, I mean, that's pretty simple as to what CRUD operations are. It's not that complicated. You just need to get your API set up, make sure that you can make requests to it. Try getting data first from your backend. If that works, then try dealing with the put and patch method, and then also post. Make sure that you can actually do all that stuff. Look at the network tab to confirm that you're actually doing the right things, and you should be fine. But that's it, guys. That's the video. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Let me know if you need any more help with APIs and how they work. If you need me to review your API setup, let me know. There's a link in the description to schedule one-on-one with me for 15 minutes. We could discuss whatever you want to discuss about APIs or just whatever in tech. All right. We'll talk soon.